Okay, I'm seeing quite a few folks flooding in, so let's go ahead and get started here. We are here to talk about state funding for public higher education, thinking specifically about what's taking place in the midst of COVID-19. But before we get into all that, I want to do some brief introductions for our panel. My name is Justin Ortegas. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Florida. I also direct our Institute of Higher Education, and I'll turn it over to Robert.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robert Kelchin. I'm an associate professor of higher education at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. Tiffany?
Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Jones. I'm Senior Director of Higher Ed Policy at the Education Trust.
Shall I introduce myself now, I suppose? Hey, y'all. This is David Tamberg. I'm a Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Strategic Initiatives at the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, better known as SHEO. Really happy to be here.
We're lucky to have David and Tiffany, who are the most popular people, according to my Twitter, on all of webinars in higher ed, so thank you very much. And a couple quick programming notes. This work is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and our other PI and co-PI are in the room here as well. Kelly Rosinger and Dominique Baker are really important to the work we're doing here, and they'll be with us next month to share in conversation as well. So first and foremost, what I'm going to do is a little bit of kind of level setting and show you some of the basic trend lines in higher ed as far as what we found in our recent policy brief through Informed States. And then that'll hopefully shape some of the conversation we're going to have here today. So as I mentioned previously, this is about state funding for public higher ed in the midst of COVID-19. So here we go. Can I work in PowerPoint? I can. Okay, so for general idea as far as total state funding for public higher education, we see there was a shallow recession in 2001, and then we had the Great Recession around late 2007 to mid 2009. And the key takeaway here is that whenever we had some peak funding levels, it was about $100 billion for all of public higher education, and you see the recessionary period moving forward. And we obviously anticipate some economic uncertainty and recessionary period moving forward in the midst of COVID-19, and just talk a little bit about what that means for both institutions and students. So speaking of different types of institutions, the one thing we want to talk about here is that you can see there are very different levels of funding for MSI institutions, minority serving institutions, and those that are non-MSI institutions. Just being aware of those general kind of trend lines and distinctions as far as the median per FTE funding by both sector and minority serving institution status. And another kind of key takeaway here, and I meant to also say that obviously you can see the big difference here is four-year level. Four-year institutions are significantly more funding than two-year institutions. And a key point as well, just to kind of wrap up a super brief level setting here, is that as you can see, just in general, minority serving institutions have a higher level of reliance on state funding than the non-minority serving institutions, just bearing that in mind when we think about public higher education broadly and what are the implications for under-resourced institutions and the students they serve. So what I'm going to do now is stop sharing the presentation and turn it over to the group. So the first question is really for Robert, and thinking about what does all this mean? So we saw some general trend lines for public higher education. What can we expect kind of moving forward in the midst of COVID-19, and what are some of the lessons learned that could inform decision-making more broadly?
Well, one thing that's clear at this point is state funding for public higher ed is likely to take a major hit, barring some kind of massive federal stimulus package for higher ed. It just came out in the higher ed press today that ACE is looking for something like $120 billion to make up losses, or at least some of the losses from colleges. Now, that's not all just for public higher ed, but it gives a sense of the gaps that colleges are seeking to fill. And one of the rare areas where states have a lot of budget flexibility, or at least they think they have budget flexibility, is higher ed. So that may be the first place they cut mid-year, as well as states try to figure out what the heck their fiscal year 21 budgets look like. And as the first chart you put up showed as well, it may take years for states to recover. It took years from the Great Recession, and this may end up being much deeper.
And what we know as far as COVID-19 is that colleges and universities have already lost billions of dollars, or over $1 billion based on the spring and the summer term. And obviously resources are currently constrained. State revenues are declining for the first time since the Great Recession. And all these factors are kind of coming into force here at one point. So one thing that's obviously a concern is equity. So a question for Tiffany: what does all this mean for not only under-resourced institutions, but also the students they serve at those institutions? And what do we need to think about kind of moving forward with those key takeaways?
Sure. Well, just a follow-up point to what Robert mentioned around the ask that colleges are making, are around 120 billion, to give you a sense of how that relates to what's actually being considered in terms of some sort of federal support for higher ed. The most that has been suggested is about 39 billion, which is in the most recent update to the HEROES Act. So that just gives you a sense of the disconnect in terms of what colleges are saying they need to stay afloat, and what types of commitments are even being discussed. Even letters from advocates that places like EdTrust has signed on to, the most for the higher ed specific set aside that has been requested is 50 billion, right? So all that to say, there's a reason for concern. It's clear colleges need more support. It's not clear that they're going to get it, much less very quickly. And so what does that mean? It means that policymakers have to do a better job, and by policymakers, specifically federal policymakers, as they're trying to support education during this time, they have to prioritize better. And so in the CARES Act, Congress spent 30 times as much on corporate bailouts than they did higher ed, right? As one example. There's also the issue of the money that was provided to higher ed, who gets it? And so it's already been discussed that the students who likely needed more financial support prior to COVID probably need more support because of COVID. But unfortunately, that support wasn't designed in a way that it was best targeted to the colleges, like community colleges or even minority serving institutions that are providing so much of the access and opportunity. And one of the main issues that's been discussed a lot is just even how you count students, right? And so by not counting part-time students, there's a discrepancy in terms of, again, community colleges doing the service of educating about 40% of the students in higher ed, but they only receive about a quarter of the funding through the CARES Act. And that matters because, again, those are funds that most institutions are spending on helping students pay for emergency needs related to food, housing, technology they need to be able to participate in classes and more. And so, again, those disparities matter because they translate into disparities felt by the students who are struggling the most during this time. And again, if I just want to flag as well, during the last recession, when institutions faced a lot of cuts, they made decisions that really created challenges for students, whether it be increasing tuition, whether it be increasing merit aid to try to get more students who could pay these higher and the full tuition prices. But whatever those decisions might be, they created more barriers for the students who already face the most challenges in higher ed. And so this is why it's going to require some intentionality by the federal government in terms of prioritizing higher ed. And then, of course, states doing their part to invest the resources they have in the most equitable ways. And that might mean prioritizing, again, community colleges, minority serving institutions that have been underfunded over time. And I mention that because, again, when you look at the previous recession, there's examples of states where they may have done equal cuts across the board, or even a larger percentage of that funding cut was felt at for example, at HBCUs. And it should be the opposite, right? And so figuring out ways, again, to prioritize the students and the institutions that are struggling the most during this time is critical.
Thanks, Tiffany. And that's kind of one of the key reasons we were showing those kind of visual trend lines earlier. When you see the huge distinctions in the level of funding received for four-year institutions relative to community colleges, and thinking more deeply about the students that affects, knowing disproportionate levels of low-income students and underrepresented minorities, students of color, really, really important to kind of think through that. So turning it now to David, this is all kind of like, we're kind of high level right now. Like, what does this mean? What does this look like? If you're in a state office or you're a state policymaker kind of forced to make difficult decisions with constrained resources, what are the types of decisions they're going to have to kind of make moving forward? And in your opinion, what should kind of be prioritized as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin, and thank you to Tiffany and Robert, and really appreciate and support the comments that they've made. And we are in an unprecedented time, and if you kind of separate policy, the term policymakers into two categories, one being lawmakers, elected folks, and then those higher ed policy specific folks that work in state higher ed agencies and system offices. I think that's a real important distinction to make. Lawmakers obviously have to look across state budgets, and they're constrained by the revenue that is coming in as they have to balance their budgets. And so, yeah, they have to make really difficult decisions. And in the midst of a pandemic, it's important to recognize that their decisions in the way they allocate and spend their money is life and death. It's the importance of the immediate concerns can't be overstated right now, and that certainly puts higher education in a difficult situation as states have to balance their budgets. And so we are observing cuts, and we will observe cuts. There's no way around that. And if you look at the data on state funding of higher ed, in a recessionary year, it's the next year that higher ed receives generally the biggest cut. And so we likely haven't seen the floor on how far down we're gonna go. And there'll likely be budget revisions mid-year for the next year or two or three. And as Robert pointed out, and your slides indicated, it's taking sequentially longer to recover from each recession. And if you adjust it per FTE, each recession's getting a bit deeper when you look over the last four, and we're recovering to a lower point than before. And so the trajectory we're on is a really difficult one. And likewise, to emphasize a point that you and Tiffany made, the traditional response is an across the board cut. But if you get 50% of your budget from the state, a 10% cut hurts a hell of a lot. If you get 9% of your budget from the state, a 10% cut can generally be it's absorbable, especially those institutions usually have more diversified revenue sources and serve a more privileged student body. And so the pattern over the last recessions is to disproportionately distribute the hurt. And the institutions most dependent on the state and those that serve the students that are most in need of resources have been hurt the most. And this recession is in particular difficult because institutions are being hurt on each side of the ledger. And so they have unanticipated significant new expenditures. And then essentially every revenue stream is being hit negatively. That's never been experienced before. No, recessions generally hit one or two revenue streams. They don't hit expenditures, and they don't hit every revenue stream the way we're observing. And so our hope is that with the work of our membership, state higher education leaders, that states can make smarter cuts. In other words, that align their cuts to state priorities and where the need is greatest. And right now, the need is to do a better job educating underrepresented students, Black students, Latinx students, Native American students, low-income students, first-generation students. By doing dumb cuts or across-the-board cuts, you're getting in the way of that priority. You're getting in the way of increasing completions, increasing educational attainment rates, receiving returns on your dollars. You receive an increase, a better return on your dollar by educating a student who otherwise wouldn't have attended college. And right now, we've got some significant headwinds. When you look at the most recent pulse survey from the census, 29% of would-be students are not going to go to college. But yet, if you look at Black students, that percentage is much higher. When you look at low-income students, that percentage is much higher. And so that's where we need to be putting our money, directed direct to those students, and not doing the politically easy thing of across-the-board cuts. Maybe I'll pause there.
No, I think those are really valid and important points. If you think about pressures for lawmakers and healthcare being literally life or death, and a lot of times folks like myself will be kind of flippant and say higher ed's a balancing wheel, given everything we know from the literature, good work from Will Doyle, Jim Delaney, and others, and just being mindful of that there's a reason that certain areas need to be prioritized in the critical way you described. Talking about some questions from the chat here, I see Drew Anderson wants to know, and I'll direct this to Robert, what kind of leeway do institutions have to raise tuition in the midst of these funding cuts at the state level? So you think of state funding and tuition as being negatively related, and students and institutions can just increase tuition and everything's great, but reality of caps and freezes might interfere. So what are your thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah, right now we're ballpark about 20 states that have formal limits on how much colleges can increase tuition or fees. In fiscal year 21, it seems like that number has ticked up a little bit more because legislators don't want to increase tuition on students during this pandemic. But colleges are also missing some of their traditional revenue sources. Out-of-state students seem to be on the decline, although it's too early to fully tell. International students seem to be down considerably. The National Student Clearinghouse report had international enrollment down 11%. And they're losing out on auxiliary enterprises. So they're really squeezed when the legislature says you can't increase tuition, or the governor or legislature basically threatens them if they do increase tuition, but it's not a formal limit. So that relationship of tuition backfilling is starting to fade as more states are trying to put a clamp on tuition increases, especially for in-state students.
And Tiffany, one thing that David talked about was the idea of the importance of thinking about reliance on state funding and how different institution types may be really invested at differing levels than others as far as the extent to which those appropriations are critical to future operations. So can you talk about not only why it's important to consider level of reliance on state funding, but what are some of the implications of budget cuts and how do they vary across institution types?
Yeah, just to emphasize, on average, about a third of colleges' funding comes from Fed, state, and local public dollars, but that at public HBCUs, for example, it's over half. And that, again, it varies from institution to institution, but to give you a sense of when we say more reliant, what does that mean on average? And I think what matters here is the consideration of where else institutions can get resources if they were to receive fewer dollars than they expected from the state. And so David started talking about this, but I think just keeping in mind, like I'm gonna use HBCUs as an example again, their endowments are 70% less on average than their peer institutions. And so you think, okay, so they get fewer private dollars, they get fewer research dollars, even from the federal government, they get, again, they're also serving students. So even if they were, that someone asked about policy in terms of being able to raise tuition, but even if institutions can raise the tuition as high as they'd like, it doesn't mean that they are serving students whose families can finance that, right, and pay for that. And we've seen some of the consequences of that with over half of Black students, defaulting on their student loans after 12 years, the racial wealth gap, which means, white families have 10 times the wealth of Black families. So that means if you're a family who needs to pay for college and college costs more than what you have fewer resources as an individual and as a household to draw from And then you're more reliant on federal and private loans to finance this education. So it's more expensive for Black students already, much less when there's tuition increases. So the implications are severe, because when you think about, well, how does that then impact the education that students are able to receive? I think on one end, an example is, if you look at community colleges, they have far fewer full-time faculty, for example. And that's not to suggest part-time faculty are not talented. It's more so pointing to the supports they receive, right? Being able to have enough pay and benefits to focus on one institution and set of students, as well as even having office space, right? To see students during office hours and some of the things that translate into impacting actual student experience. And part of the reason they don't have more full-time faculty as opposed to public four-year institutions is because of funding, right? So some of these things can translate. Again, folks will say, oh, community colleges, they should focus on student success and outcomes or increase their graduation rates. But some of the practices that the research suggests will help in terms of increasing the number of advisors, for example, certain technology or other student success practices cost money. And so if they don't have the money, that impacts students in terms of the supports they're able to receive. And again, dropping out of college and not completing your degree is actually quite expensive, right? So I talk about Black students, but of course those students with some college and no degree are also more likely to default on their student loans as well. So just pointing to the implications for students' experiences that they have, the quality of the education they're able to receive when institutions don't have the resources they need to support them properly, can create a lot of challenges, but in turn, it can also be quite costly, especially as states, have attainment goals because they feel like higher ed is the right thing to do, but also they understand the economic implications of having a more educated workforce. And so they won't be able to meet those economic goals as well if they aren't investing in higher ed.
And I think if I could, Justin, just build off of something a couple of things that Tiffany and Robert brought up. And right now, SHIO is involved in a project examining the relationship between state funding of higher ed and institutional outcomes. And what we're seeing in the literature and also in our data analysis is that there's a pretty direct relationship between state support, either increased funding or cuts, and completions and a number of other important outcomes. And so it's a like you said, Justin, it's a really tough case to make right now. But what we are seeing is that states appear to get a larger return on their investment in higher education when the institution has a higher dependency on the state. So if the state funding makes up a larger share, putting money towards those institutions, and likewise the students that they serve, directing financial aid towards students that appear to benefit the greatest has the greatest return. And so there is an idea of approaching the kind of the recession and pandemic that we're experiencing in more strategic ways that aligns state funding and directing it where it needs the most with your financial aid strategy, and also with tuition setting. And like Robert said, there's some states have state level or system level control over tuition setting policy. And that can be used in a way that's beneficial, or it can be used in ways that's really harmful to higher ed. And the alignment of those three finance strategies in a way that maximizes the use of state dollars and protects lower income students, I think is what we're looking for. And one additional way that I think everyone on this call, whether it's Robert and Kelly and Justin and Tiffany and everyone involved in your work knows, is that there's really bad ways to approach performance funding that can really do a potential harm. And then there may be ways that can be done that better aligns with that overall strategy of effective use of state dollars, where you're cognizant of the potential regressive nature of it, of redistributing money away from lower resource institutions to higher ones. And I think there's a way that the formulas can be structured so that may not happen. And then rewarding student institutions that enroll and graduate underrepresented students. And I think you have to approach finance at any point in any year, but particularly right now, in a way that's far more strategic and aligned than we see in most states. So maybe I'll leave it there.
And I think that's a really apt place to leave it, because it speaks to Andrew's question from earlier, which he's asking specifically about minority serving institutions and just kind of like thinking through what are some ways they can kind of be strategic with funding with the goal to increase graduation and retention in the same way that Tiffany was alluding to earlier. So I guess, Tiffany, since you brought up the point earlier, if you have any thoughts on this, I'll kind of like tee you off here a little bit. A lot of times folks say, well, you got to spend the money on instruction and you got to spend the money on, you know, academic services, student advisor ratios. Any general takeaways about kind of how to try to be strategic about how institutions are spending money to try to optimize the bang for the buck that David referenced earlier?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I'm going to be honest. I'm hesitant to make recommendations that institutions that are already doing more with less figure out how to do more with even less as a primary solution. And I think there's great examples of how these institutions have already, like, for example, HBCUs are responsible for, you know, close to a fourth of the Black bachelor's degrees, but they're serving closer to 10 to 15% of Black students. So they're efficient and they're investing strategically, and that's a good thing. And to David's point earlier, that makes investing in these institutions a great investment from states where they can prioritize. So I'm not sure if the solution is that they figure out how to be more efficient than that. I do think it's more of a conversation for states and the federal government when they think about the limited pool of higher ed funds they have. What do you do with them? And to the point, I like that the question is focused on student outcomes and success. And oftentimes there's, you know, sometimes folks will have a pot of money set aside to do completion related initiatives and things like that. I think it's just keeping in mind who those funds are for. Sometimes if they're set up like a competition, the institutions that have a robust grants office are best positioned to win and get additional funds to do cool, innovative things. And that might not be the point. Also, policymakers should, knowing how severe cuts have been and the fact that institutions never fully recovered from the last recession and now we're in this crisis, I would also encourage policymakers to not set up competitions where institutions have to try some new shiny thing. They might need funding to pay for more faculty and advisors because that matters to student outcomes, as long as they can clearly articulate that what they're investing in is connected to student success and there's evidence to suggest that's the case, but not to have to force them or pressure them to make up something new because they really might need some of the basics met, even facilities, right? Especially as trying to retrofit campuses to, you know, for technology needs and others. Oftentimes, again, the focus too often with policymakers is obviously they just need to do something different we haven't heard of, and that's not always the case. There needs to be a balance and more dollars available for institutions to, you know, kind of pay for some of those core things, teaching and learning, facilities, et cetera, but especially with an eye towards student success.
One thing that I really liked that Tiffany started with the idea of you know, it gets really tiring when people say those without just need to spend their money better. It's like, it makes no sense. But one thing that's kind of interesting in the literature on the effect of increased state appropriations on institutional outcomes is a number of the studies have assessed how do institutions spend those additional dollars. And by and large, they're spent on things like academic support, academics, and student support services. These institutions know how to spend the dollars. It's not a question of how it's being spent. It's the pool of money coming in, and this is especially true. You see that most evident among the tuition-dependent institutions, and there's been some good research by Marvin Titus on others on the efficiency of like master's granting institutions and the like. And you know, we can always do better, but I don't think the first place I would look is let's take away money and you just be smarter with the way you use it. Maybe there's something to be gained there, but not as much as advocating for resources for these appropriations dependent institutions.
And performance funding in the literature has kind of gotten a meh in a lot of cases, but this is where a real equity focused performance funding system can pay dividends, because that's where funding can be protected more at colleges doing a good job serving the target populations in a state. And I do worry that some states will be putting their performance funding systems that are equity focused on hold and just giving across the board cuts. So that's what Colorado is doing. They're doing a 5% across the board cut last time I heard, instead of trying to keep their formula. While in New Jersey, they're keeping the formula in the budget that just got signed today. So states are taking different paths on trying to use performance funding in a strategic way to close some of these gaps.
And this is really an interesting conversation because it ties a little bit to things we talk about in classrooms as far as think about sociological theory of the Matthew effect. And the general takeaway there is that you have advantages for the already advantages and bake in disadvantages for those who are already disadvantaged in the first place, which really does speak to Tiffany's point about this idea of external funding or grant making, and thinking about like who has technology in place to really absorb these challenges and create efficiencies in ways that can serve students at scale. And oftentimes those with limited funding are then kind of expected to figure it out without the resources as the other institutions that can maybe respond accordingly. Robert, I'm going to pivot a little bit here and go back to an earlier question I saw from the chat from Drew. And he talked about this idea that, you know, earlier Tiffany referenced some federal, maybe some federal monies coming through to the states. And thinking about, okay, whether it's completion initiatives or what are some of the strings attached that states can expect with an infusion of federal money? Is it keeping costs down, Pell graduation rates? What could that look like as far as the strings that could be tied to federal money at the state level?
So this is something that has been tried in the past. During the Great Recession, the string was maintenance of effort. It wasn't tied to student outcomes. It was just tied to the state continuing spending. It's going to be difficult politically, I think, to have some kind of federal performance funding system like this. The Obama administration tried going down that route when they tried college ratings. They got a lot of pushback, but it could potentially be done with enough of a focus toward community colleges and minority serving institutions. But that also has the potential to upset the lobby for the larger, more advantaged institutions. So I'm pessimistic about anything other than maintenance of effort making its way in.
I see a politics of higher ed question. I'm glad David's here to speak to this idea, but Craig asked, you know, how is higher ed's ability to influence policy and financing really dependent on lawmakers or voters' perception of the value of higher education, particularly in the current kind of extreme environment as thinking through the politics and kind of this current day and age? So what are your general takeaways from that question, David?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think all of us who are involved in higher education policy, either as researchers, advocates, or analysts, have been really watching quite closely the kind of trend that we're seeing in the national polls that are showing a increased distrust in higher education. And in fact, some Republican or conservative circles seeing it as actual harm to society. And, you know, the question from a research perspective and a policy perspective is how long until that public opinion or perception begins to manifest in actual policy actions at the state or federal level. And I would argue that we're beginning to see that. The Chronicle reporting on the partisanship making its way into system level boards recently is a good example of that. And you know, it puts unnecessary headwinds in front of the work that many of us are trying to engage in. And you know, some of the wounds in higher ed may be self-inflicted, but not always. And it appears, I think, that often you see those that are more conservative or Republican, whether they're governors or leading higher ed agencies, their approach to state higher education policy is pretty similar to someone who is a Democrat or a liberal. Where it changes is if an individual decides to make social issues higher education issues, or the hot social debate, and they extend that into the higher education policy realm, and that can be very dangerous for higher education, and it can really negatively impact funding, policy decisions, and the like. And I fear that that's happening more and more, and it's a tough issue to deal with.
And I'll turn it over now to Tiffany, who is in DC making really evidence-based advocacy, really informed work, really do meaningful kind of work in that area. So I think one key takeaway is that I think about your work, Tiffany, for performance funding, and this idea that what Robert referenced about the importance of equity-focused bonuses or premiums, and a lot of states, because of the partisan nature we're talking about, will just say at-risk students, and no one even know what that looks like or what that means. And kind of, can you speak to about like how to kind of navigate what is a hyper-partisan climate in a way that kind of centers evidence and benefits all types of students, and especially those who need it the most?
Yeah, I think the first step is being honest with policymakers around what we're learning around what the impact of their decisions are and will be. And so I'm going to be honest, we put out a report at the beginning of the year called Hard Truths, where we advocate for race-conscious policy at the institution, state, and federal levels, and we put examples of what we mean by that, and it includes some of these funding incentives we talk about that are explicit, though, about race. And we've had a lot of conversations, especially since May and June, when there's this national reckoning and conversations around race with all kinds of people across the political spectrum around these ideas. And I'm gonna be honest, there's less resistance than you would expect. Partners who invited us to have these conversations were like, just be prepared. Folks are not really ready to deal with race, you know? And we show up and folks may not have all the answers, but they're like, I get the sense we should probably do something, right? So I want to, you know, can be a very doom and gloom conversation, but just a little like silver lining is that there seems to be a growing readiness, even if states haven't done things before, policymakers haven't done things before. There's a broader base of folks who are at least acknowledging something probably needs to be done here. And I think what's important to emphasize is too long in higher ed, I would say over the last decade, made the mistake of focusing on student outcomes at the expense of the access question. It's a both and for sure, but in no way were we where we need to be on the access question. And so these financial incentives are critical, but again, they were often manifested in ways that only focused on completion rates, retention rates, or outcomes, and not enrollment. Higher ed is not giving out dollars in a really meaningful and significant way based on who's enrolled, which is why stratification exists. And I'm sure most of the folks on the call are very well already, came to this call already aware that the fact that there are certain colleges that are enrolling most of the underserved students with fewer resources. What they may not be aware of is that it's getting worse in many cases. And so just an example of one report at Trust, Andrew Nichols from our research team wrote a report called Segregation Forever, and he did an analysis this summer of 101 of the most selective public colleges and universities. And he found that nearly half of them were doing worse than they were in the past in terms of providing access to bachelor's degrees for Black students and enrolling Black students into these highly selective four-year institutions. And so again, I think that context matters. So when you talk to someone who says, I think we should do something, where should I start? I actually encourage them to start with the access question. And if there are barriers, policy barriers to them actually addressing race specifically, not necessarily income or first-gen status, which can be done in addition to, but not in replace of race, it's important giving that context around why it's urgent, but also there's other policy changes that might be necessary. So for example, in California right now, Proposition 16 is on the ballot in November. If voters may decide that to adopt that policy, that would remove the existing statewide ban on affirmative action. That matters. California was the first state to have such a ban in place. And whether the states have such a ban, it has a chilling effect in higher ed in terms of, can we really say race? I'm nervous. Will we get in trouble? Will we get sued? Is this the right thing to do? And so I think it can be very symbolic for folks even beyond California, if voters swing that way. UC Board of Regents already voted unanimously in support of removing that ban. They voted unanimously to get rid of affirmative action 25 years ago. They're like, we messed up. So that was a mistake. And so again, it's just an example of where we're encouraging folks to begin those conversations.
And Tiffany did a very nice job of moving us back over to optimism lane and thinking about some positive takeaways. And it sounds like, not as hyper-partisan as one may think. There are some ways we can get to common ground. So in the spirit of that question, Robert, Dan Kent asked us also to try and move us away from doom and gloom, which is, are there any current events in higher ed, policy, funding, budgets, et cetera, that really give you hope and you can kind of point to as bright spots moving forward for public higher education more broadly?
I would say some of the bright spots are college or states really thinking about funding formulas, that they're starting to re-examine the traditional formulas that were whatever the backroom agreement was in 1965, add or subtract 2% every year. I think there's thoughts on being strategic, and it seems like there are also more conversations happening about strategically leveraging appropriations to colleges and then also grant aid to students. So we'll talk about this more in future webinars, but the importance of grant aid and state support for higher ed is growing. So I think there are some green shoots here. The challenge is, do they get through the likelihood of mid-year budget cuts to come in many states? And then do they survive political bickering after that?
David, we have a question from the great Kelly Rosinger, and she wants to know if you could create a funding model for public colleges from the ground up, knowing what we know from the current state of evidence and what appears to work in public higher ed. What would it look like from your perspective, and what should states be prioritizing with such a model?
Wow. Yeah, I've actually thought about that some, and I share Robert's optimism that we are moving in a better way in regards to our funding formula, where we explicitly have equity indicators for the enrollment and success of Black students, Latinx students, low-income students, first-generation Native American, and those have to be in there. But where I'm less optimistic about their potential impact is they're being placed on centuries, decades of very regressive finance approaches. And so yet I don't think we can expect to see the change that we need by just layering on some equity indicators built within a larger performance funding. That is good. Let's do that. And if you don't do it, don't do performance funding. But if we were to go ideal, if dream world, you would completely restructure our funding system. You wouldn't nickel and dime it. What I would advocate for is an understanding of what it costs to successfully graduate different types of students within different types of institutions. And what is an adequate amount of funding for an institution to fulfill its larger mission and graduate the types of students they enroll and that we want them to enroll. And so that would be the base level of funding, right? It would be an adequacy-driven approach. And then you would put on top of that, maybe 3, 4, 5 years down the road, an equity-driven performance funding model. That's what we have not adequately addressed the question of adequacy in funding. The Century Foundation has picked that challenge up and has done some good work when it comes to community colleges, but we need to extend that and really flip the way we fund and look at what does the state want from this institution? What does it cost to successfully have them successfully do that? And I think that's first. And like I said, I'm a big fan of the equity indicators within performance funding programs. And we should have them, and they're good, but they're just cannot be large enough for this radical redistribution of resources within higher ed that we need. And one real quick thing is, Tiffany was mentioning the conversations around race, explicit conversations around race happening now more than what we've seen in the past. And I absolutely agree. And I think that's one of the real bright spots in the current, where we're at right now. And it also, one thing that I think is just really cool is that I don't think we would be able to start having these conversations, as difficult as sometimes they are and as awkward as many of us like me are, were it not for the years and years of work of people that came before who have been calling out the race question for decades before. And, like Ed Trust has always been willing to talk about race explicitly. Estella Ben-Simone, Sean Harper, and many, many others positioned us to now have these conversations, those that have lagged behind them in having these conversations. If that hadn't happened, I don't think we would now be having race show up in performance funding programs, and we wouldn't be having these conversations even in very Republican states.
That's a really important point, David, about the idea of if it were simple, it probably wouldn't solve a complicated problem. A simple fix cannot solve a complicated problem oftentimes. So you hear about senior leaders, whether higher education or otherwise, that the really easy decisions are solved at lower levels. So if it's a really convoluted, systemically rooted challenge in higher ed finance, throwing an equity bonus is kind of like really important, but obviously not going to be the standalone solution to that challenge. Tiffany, I really would be interested in hearing about follow up on, David talked about this idea of adequacy, and I've really only seen that in K-12 literature. You have to see it really in a lot of higher ed literature about the adequate dollar being spent as far as student outcomes, and really trying to be intentional and thinking about that with an eye toward equity. Any ideas or thoughts about this general notion of adequacy in higher education funding?
Sure. I mean, there's a quick answer to that. It doesn't exist in I would say, in a way that's been thoroughly studied and all of that. There's not some set of research that everyone agrees on in the field and says, okay, this is how you find out what adequate funding is. I know that folks like on this call, like Robert and others, are interested in those questions, that care about finance and higher ed. But higher ed is not where K-12 is in terms of having a sense of what that means. I think that's a longer journey. I don't think that's gonna be fixed overnight, right? But I want to point out though, we could still have conversations about inequitable funding, even as that longer research and work will be done to try to craft and understand and develop the methods to determine, what adequate funding is in higher ed. And I say that because, again, right now, spending 3 times as much on public four-year institutions than we spend on community colleges, not equitable, or 5 times as much on private four-year institutions than we do per student on community colleges, not equitable, especially when private institutions get so many public dollars, right? So it's just important, I think, sometimes I've seen it used as a barrier. Well, if you don't have an agreed upon number in higher ed, how can we ever have conversations about what should be done to make funding equitable? And I just disagree and would say, I do think that that's an important body of research that should continue to progress. But I also think in the meantime, folks can use common sense in terms of what inequitable funding means. They have great data on who their students are and what resources are coming into higher ed with. There's great data that is demonstrated even this week, another study from the Federal Reserve showing what many studies showed before, which is small amounts of money, even $1,000 can have an impact on students enrolling or remaining enrolled. So with that information, I think higher ed institutions as well as policymakers have what they need to make better decisions about how to invest their funds more equitably. And the last thing I'll say on that is, even in the absence of a agreed upon number of what is equitable funding versus what's not, there have been lawsuits, just like in K-12 in higher ed, where higher ed institutions, states have been sued for funding inequity, just like in K-12. In K-12, often these formulas are used to help in those lawsuits, but higher ed has their own history there. A great example of that is the Adams case from the 70s, a Supreme Court case that involved 19 states that were found guilty of funding separate and unequal systems of higher ed, mostly because of the funding disparities. And again, the outcome of that were states were expected to, submit plans on how they were going to rectify these changes, but it was never enforced. A lot of states never even submitted plans, much less did what they said they wouldn't have planned. Those lawsuits continue to today, even in Maryland, that lawsuit continues to go on. Just as an example of, again, not having an agreed upon number on what is adequate funding does not slow down what is equitable funding conversation, nor any type of litigation that's necessary to get students the resources they deserve.
Thanks, Tiffany. I want to pivot now to the Richard Romano portion of the program. A couple of points and a question from him. First and foremost, just to put a point on Tiffany's point, not talking about the notion that adequacy has entered discussions on community colleges, but not necessarily in a straightforward way in policy. And many folks in practice and policy point to CUNY ASAP is really doing a nice job of getting a bang for the buck and kind of like moving forward. So a question from Richard is this idea for, I'll ask Robert, is a new higher ed bill out for this Congress, and what can we expect kind of moving forward in that realm?
So if we're talking higher ed reauthorization, that will be a long time. If we're talking about additional funding for higher ed through a stimulus package or a follow-up CARES Act, before the election, that looks to be extraordinarily unlikely, just because everyone's out campaigning and the Senate has Supreme Court nomination to wrangle with. After the election, maybe, but I could also see, depending on the results, waiting for January to do something.
And one thing I'd like to do, oftentimes you throw out a lot of questions and answers in these types of conversations, and there's a lot to kind of consider. So I'd like to ask the panel, if you could think of one key takeaway you want to make sure that policymakers walk away from this conversation to consider, what would that look like? So if you don't mind, I'll start with David, kind of like one key takeaway from this type of conversation. What's important to think about moving forward?
Well, it's a really good question. I guess for me, it's the need for policymakers and all of us to understand that every dollar really does matter. That I think Tiffany's point of $1,000 has an impact. And I think we could probably walk that down to, in some cases, $50 is a deciding factor of enrolling or staying enrolled. And when it comes to the institutions themselves, so many of them have so little flexibility. every dollar is used. And so every additional dollar that an institution receives, or every additional dollar that's cut from their budget, has real world implications. And often those implications are felt by the students who have the least and who we need to do a much better job by. And so I guess my takeaway is these dollars are sacred, and we should really treat them that way.
Tiffany, anything to add as far as one high level takeaway for policymakers walking away from this conversation?
Yeah, equity is not optional. So I think it's been, too often treated as like an add-on, a nice to have. If we are able to survive plus address equity, cool. And no, it's not optional. It doesn't really work that way. That it's going to have to be intentional. It doesn't require new money, right? Equity should be a part of what you do with new money. It should be a part of what you do with your existing money. It should be a part of what you think about when you're making cuts and all of the decisions in between. And just kind of a last piece, I know those conversations are tough because there's a lot of important competing priorities, but just keeping in mind also that framing matters, and this isn't a nice to have, and also these aren't students who have abnormal needs. Students need the same things. Some students have been systemically denied access to the resources and opportunities that all students need to be successful, whether prepared engaged instructors, technology, transportation, childcare, whatever it is, all students need access to those things. Some students need more support in actually accessing them because they've been systemically denied. And I think that framing, again, is key for policymakers who have to convince others or might be stuck on why this has to be at the forefront. And too often we frame it as, well, some students have such greater need than others. But just being careful about that framing. There's nothing wrong with these students. They belong in higher ed. Their tax dollars support these institutions, but they've been shut out. And so policymakers have a responsibility to right those wrongs as a part of their decision making.
And if you're interested in Robert's takeaways, he was the lead author on our policy brief, State Funding for Public Higher Education in the Midst of COVID-19. Anything to add that's not in that policy brief, Robert, as far as big picture takeaways for this conversation here today?
Yeah, the big picture is it's really easy for states to do across the board budget cuts. Politically, it's easy. It's not necessarily the wisest way to spend money. So think carefully about when you have to cut and how to make that the least painful for students who need it the most.
And I have about 27 seconds to be respectful of everybody's time here. But what I want to say is if you have time and space on your calendar, please, we're going to have another webinar late next month. Talking about how states offer student financial aid. So today is about how states fund colleges, and Kelly and Dominique will be leading that conversation once again with Tiffany and David, and they're really going to be offering some important evidence-based insights to think through about states, public higher ed, and financial aid more broadly. So thank you so much for joining us here today. We appreciate your time, and have a good day.